Good morning from FMC. Thank you to our panelists and our moderator for taking the time out of your busy schedules to have this important conversation. And thank you to our audience members for joining this panel, How to Make Congress More Effective, a conversation with the leaders of the House Select Committee on Modernization. We're especially interested in this discussion because of FMC's recently published Congress at a Crossroads report, which interviewed over 30 former members who left Congress the last cycle and provided FMC with the great honor of testifying before the committee. The entire report, along with numerous concrete recommendations drawn from this project, many of which mirror the recommendations of the committee, can be found on our website at usafmc.org/congressxroads. This will be an interactive conversation, so you're welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have a question at any point. Later in the conversation, several audience members who have submitted their name with an inquiry will be called on by the moderator to ask their questions over audio only. This conversation will be recorded and will be shared on our website at usafmc.org/sounds. We are ecstatic to have such a distinguished panel for this event, and I'm delighted to first introduce the moderator of this discussion, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty, who represented Connecticut's 5th District from 2013 to 2019. She served on the committees on Veterans Affairs, Transportation and Infrastructure, and Science, Space, and Technology. She is now a board member and a sustaining member of FMC and participated in FMC's Congress at a Crossroads report. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Haley, and thank you to my good friends Derek and Tom, and actually a number of colleagues and former colleagues who I know are on the call, as well as a lot of our great partners in this project. We actually have a lot of people on the line today because of the great interest and concern, frankly, about the Article 1 branch. I have the pleasure of having served with both Derek and Tom, being friends with both, a gym buddy of Tom's and committee, and Derek and I started together in Congress and count each other, all of us, as friends. So I know we're in good company here today. I'm going to spare the usual long laudatory things about both of you, and there's lots to say, and we are sorry to see you leaving, Tom. Let me just add that note. But I am excited to have you here today because I think the endeavor you've engaged in is so tremendously important. This is one of the really important select subcommittees. So what I'd like to do is actually have the great state of Washington start off with Derek, followed by the great state of Georgia, and have you talk a little bit about the mission of the committee, the recommendations, but also a little bit about process. I've talked with folks who worked with you, and I do think how things are done does matter, and incentives matter, and I think you demonstrated that in the way you both worked on this committee, and I think that's perhaps a good place in part to start to remind people of what needs to change. Tone and tenor, and that's part of what I know from both of you personally, you're both very committed to, and I think does make a difference. So Derek, you want to start out a little bit, and followed by Tom, and then we'll get into a conversation.
Terrific. Thanks, Elizabeth. It's great to be here with you. Elizabeth was a great classmate, a great leader, and a great friend. Not a gym buddy for me, because that's just not something I do. But I also want to thank the former members of Congress Association for hosting us today. We really appreciate your continued interest in the work of the Select Committee, especially as we work through our final weeks of recommendations and the text of our final report. And thanks for having me here along with Tom, who's just been a terrific partner in this endeavor. We were joking before coming on, we're a bit the Statler and Waldorf now of Congress, having done so many joint appearances together, but I think it's a testament to his spirit of partnership and the spirit of partnership that you've seen on this committee. And I join Elizabeth in saying I'll be sad to see him join the former members of Congress Association. I think many of you are familiar with our work, but for folks who aren't, maybe I'll provide just a little bit of background on the committee. Every few decades or so, Congress realizes that things aren't functioning the way they ought to, and they set up a committee to do something about it. They look inward, they decide that that Congress needs to fix itself. So Congress generally forms bipartisan select committees and charges them with figuring out what the problems are and recommending solutions. We're the latest incarnation of that. The last one was formed in 1992. Our committee was created as part of the rules package at the beginning of the 116th Congress. And our committee consists of 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. Our mandate's pretty broad. We've been tasked with looking at things like House rules and procedures, with technology and innovation, the recruitment, retention, and diversity of staff, and to look at constituent communication. And we've also looked at issues that don't, frankly, fit neatly into our mandate, but that we feel are really important, like civility. We also just passed a set of 12 recommendations focused on the continuity of government that address some of the challenges congressional offices have faced working through the COVID-19 pandemic. Like other past select committees, we don't have legislative authority, but we are packaging our recommendations into legislation as a way of ensuring that they actually get implemented further on down the road. Legislation that includes our first two set of recommendations passed the House in March, which was a first for committees like this. We'll be introducing legislation that includes our third and fourth sets of recommendations, plus any additional recommendations we pass before our committee expires, which under the rule that established us is the end of October. There are a couple of things about this committee that I think really make it unique. And one is it's truly bipartisan. I mentioned that we have 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. I chair the committee and Tom serves as vice chair, but we work as partners, as do our committee members. The bipartisan collaboration on this committee has been so encouraging. We're proving that it's possible for members from both sides of the aisle to sit down together, engage in tough conversations, and ultimately to find bipartisan solutions to some of the challenges that we all face. We have a united, nonpartisan staff with one budget and one office. There are no red jerseys or blue jerseys on our team. We have outfitted everyone in fixed Congress jerseys. You know, and I think that breaks with the tradition of dividing resources between the parties. And I'm really grateful to Tom and the Republicans on the committee for embracing that approach. And I think it is has been a big part of the success we've had as a committee. We're doing something a little bit different. We are adopting recommendations on a rolling basis. Most previous select committees have issued end-of-year reports that contain all of their recommendations. And our approach is to find consensus and then to move when we have consensus. You know, and that's something I felt pretty strongly about. I had served on the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. And on that committee, we spent a year holding hearings and developing recommendations only to see all of our work go up in flames in the final meeting because we weren't able to pass recommendations. So we decided early on that the Modernization Committee was going to take a different approach. So far, we've unanimously passed 57 recommendations, so I'd say it's working. We are hoping to take up another 3 or 4 dozen recommendations next week, and we're going to be banging away on those for the next couple of weeks in hopes of getting those into the end zone. We've also played around with some small but not insignificant things. So for example, we'll sometimes mix up the seating at our hearings so that members aren't divided by party. When we did a hearing on next generation leadership issues, we actually handed the gavel over to our 2 freshman members so that they could co-chair the meeting. So we're trying to do things a little bit differently, conscious of the fact that we want to make Congress work better for the American people. So again, as I turn it over to Tom, let me just thank everybody for your interest in the work that we're doing. I certainly look forward to our conversation today.
Well, thanks, Derek. It's good to be with you again, and Elizabeth, good to see you. I hope things are going well, and to the former members group, I guess I'll be joining you soon. I've already sent in my application. I look forward to continuing the work that I guess y'all have done in the past in your congressional career, and then as you've moved on from there to stay engaged and continue the process. And so thanks for hosting this today. You know, as the chair said, we're so grateful for your interest in the Modernization Committee and what we're trying to do to modernize Congress. We have had an amazing 18 months, I guess. It started out with a great mandate from the House of Representatives, and I think y'all know from a Republican and Democrat perspective as former members that normally when you vote on a rules package at the beginning of a Congress, the party in power, that's the one that's going to ultimately pass the rules package, and it's a partisan vote. Well, this one rule to create this select committee was pulled out, in fact, so that it could be voted on and supported by both parties because of the understanding and the need to do something to fix Congress. And so the chair here, Derek, has done an amazing job really aligning us as a committee and putting us in a direction that is that's been set up for success from the early days. And might I say, we never could have anticipated the pandemic days coming in the middle of all the work we were doing, and to see his adjustment through that time and guiding our committee through that. It's been remarkable. So my hope is this committee will be an example for other committees. I know we have an amazing set of recommendations. As the chair said, over 50 have already been passed out of the committee. And they're focused on the future of the legislative branch. And for us, as we serve our communities, the ultimate goal is just serve the American people better. But that aside, I hope that other members will one day look back at this committee and go, you know what, it can happen. Republicans and Democrats, they can work together. There is a way to do that, even when it's split right down the middle, when it's evenly divided in a committee. There is a way in which you can work together in a collaborative process and such, and get everybody on board with the common goals. And that's really where Derek set us up for success early in the beginning. And that was, we took the whole committee, not the Republican side didn't go off and plan how they were going to run the committee and the Democrats go plan their side. Instead, it was all of us coming together to really look at what are we going to do? What is our mandate as it's spelled out in the rule? And then how do we apply that over the next several weeks and months? And in a process and in a way that's never been defined or done like we chose to do. And so Derek, congratulations on, as we bring this, I guess, around term 4 here as we're working our way towards the finish line. But it's really been a bright spot for us. I know there's going to be a lot of questions as we go through this over the next several minutes. But we've heard from you. I might as well say that early on, is that we thank you for your input. We had a former members day where we had members come and speak with us. And it was sort of the topic, was, well, what would you have done different? If you could change one thing, what would it be? Or what would have kept you around a little bit longer? Why did you leave? And what would have been the difference to have stayed and applied your expertise and knowledge and experience one more term? That feedback was really helpful. We also had a members day where just a tremendous amount of new members, incoming freshmen, to senior members, to leadership came and testified before the committee to express some of their thoughts. And while all our recommendations are all over the board, and my focus was with cybersecurity or with some other things, but I think what we found, the consensus of the breakdown potentially is relationships. And as former members, you know the importance of relationships. And that's the common question that people ask me when I go back home is, why is it the way it is today versus the way it used to be in the past? And why can't people get along? And so the chair really has looked at ways, how do we strengthen relationships between all members? And it's not just between opposite parties. Sometimes it's internally as well. But how do you do things to begin restoring and strengthening relationships so that in the end, as a collaborative body, that's supposed to work together for the common interest of all our constituents, can actually reach conclusions and consensus in a positive way. So we've seen a lot of focus on that. You'll see in our recommendations. Some of it relates to calendar, how the calendar can influence the strengthening of relationships. A lot of it has to do with retreats and doing the full retreat of, that is not a partisan retreat, but it's all members from the House, and setting aside time for that, or setting aside member space within the Capitol where it's just members, Republicans and Democrats, that can be there, not staff and not press or other folks, but just where people can really get together and begin to strengthen relationships and restoring some of those. So we've seen a lot of challenges over the last year, as you have as well, and it's been exciting to watch the committee work through each and every bit of these challenges as we come to the end. And so I'm delighted to be a part of this. And Derek, I can't thank you enough for the way you've guided this committee, and I look forward to taking some questions as we dig a little deeper and maybe unpack some of the recommendations that we've had.
Well, great. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Tom. And to remind folks, you can go ahead already now. And if you want to put a question into chat, I'd urge you to do that. And that way we'll be able to pull up questions and can move a little faster. And to let people know, these two gentlemen probably have votes. As you may know, we tried scheduling this at a point which it seemed like a good time to do. And now, of course, they may have votes intervening. So we want to get to things as quickly as we can. Tom, I want to pick up in part where you left off, because I would tell you that was the number one takeaway from the Legacy Project that a number of the folks who worked with FMC supported, was really the breakdown of relationships. And that I was told when I came to Washington, I asked old Washington hands, how can I be effective as a junior member, deep in the minority? And they said, you can't work with people and do deals with people you don't trust, and you can't trust people you don't know. And it seems to me there's so many things that mitigate against that right now. I'm glad that you focused on that. And there's a real tension, it seems, and a number of people have talked to me knowing we were doing this session, of how much is norms and how much is incentives and how much is rules. It's easiest to pass a package of rules, but norms really are sort of deeper than that. And the incentive structure, which, and all of those things are tied together. Do you feel that you were able to kind of touch on the norms? One question, and I'm really curious to see what reaction you're getting from people. If people are like, oh, okay, another set of recommendations, we'll toss this over. If people are actually engaging, saying like, I think this is important. I think we need to change things. So maybe we'll start with Tom and then we'll toss it back and forth.
Sure. Yeah. And I know Derek will want to speak to this.
Sure.
So Elizabeth, you'll remember, and I think all members remember this. It starts from day one. And when a new member is elected, you become a member elect. You go into the leadership elections 1 week after you've been elected, and you're tossed into Washington, D.C. And you go into your freshman orientations, and you're directed to get on different buses, in essence, say, okay, Republicans, you're going to go over here and you're going to learn how to be a member of Congress the Republican way. And Democrats, you're going to go over here and you're going to learn how to be a member of Congress the Democrat way. Even though you're learning the same things about the filings and hiring and staffing and such that are procedural, from day one, it starts off partisan, and you're not allowed to commingle in essence. I mean, you have to be very, very intentional, but it's hard because of the demands of your time. And so one of our early recommendations to incentivize, and we have a whole section of civility and bipartisanship where our focus was, but to incentivize the development of relationships early was to encourage bipartisan orientation, so that when a new class comes in, and in fact, my class in 2010, it was near 100 new members, and 80 plus, I think, maybe it was 87 were Republicans. So they're all in one spot and the Democrats are in another spot, when in fact, it probably would have been much better for all of us to learn how to do our new jobs together. So I'll stop with that one, but that was one of the very first ways we can begin. I know Derek will want to talk about the bipartisan retreat concept and other civility concepts we've had promoted.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Obviously some of the recommendations in this space came from former members. When we had our former member hearing, this was an area that got a lot of attention, in part because I think a lot of members leave because of the toxicity of this place. And it's hard being a member of a body that, according to recent polling, is less popular than head lice, colonoscopies, and the band Nickelback. And that definitely informs some of the recommendations that we've made. So far, we've made recommendations in the civility and bipartisanship space, including some things that you wouldn't necessarily think to at first blush. So for example, we have a recommendation to create some bipartisan members-only space within the Capitol to encourage more collaboration across party lines. Because right now, as many of you will remember, there's just not that much in the way of opportunity for members to engage one another, Democrats and Republicans. When you do it on the House floor, it is within the glare of the lights of C-SPAN. Obviously, the Speaker's lobby is now entirely taken over by the media. And, so one of our recommendations was to create some dedicated space in the Capitol where private bipartisan discussion could occur, with the notion that it's hard to grow civility if members don't have an opportunities to engage one another in a bipartisan way. Tom mentioned one of our recommendations is to establish bipartisan retreats for members and for their families at the start of each Congress. And I know that's something that existed, and many of you may have been in Congress when that existed. We had testimony from Ray LaHood about just the importance of that and having colleagues get to know each other better. So that was one of the recommendations that we made as well. We also made a recommendation focused on within committees trying to engender more bipartisan engagement and make sure that even things like allowing committee staff and personal office staff to participate in CODELs as a means of developing those relationships, and also within committees, having some of the staff briefings and agenda setting happen more in a bipartisan way. And frankly, that's how we've done it on this committee. Just, our agenda at the beginning of this, we all got together, Democrats and Republicans, and said, what do we want to get out of this experience? What do we care about? What are we willing to work on? Where are we willing to work together? And then throughout this process, we've had our members and their staffs briefed in a bipartisan way. That's something we recommend trying to do more of more broadly.
That is great. I wondered how the pandemic has changed this. Obviously, I was curious whether your continuity of government recommendations, whether that was originally sort of something you were looking to focus on. Certainly after 9/11, there was discussion about that. Tom, with your cybersecurity background, you might have been thinking about that. But I have to believe that what's happened has changed some of that focus. Could you maybe start, Derek, and that's appropriate? And it was pretty heavily stacked with Washington, just noting the state of Washington on your membership. But can you talk a little bit about that and how that's changed the focus and changed the attention?
Yeah, I will say up front, the committee was scheduled actually to do a hearing related to the continuity of Congress the week that the Capitol was shut down as a consequence of COVID. So, and I know that there are many former members, including I saw speaking of Washingtonians, my friend Brian Baird, who's been a real leader on that subject of continuity. Absolutely, the virus and the impacts of it impacted both the work of the committee, and that we ourselves went to having virtual discussions as a committee and have done a half dozen or so of those while Congress has been, in essence, working remotely. But also, we ended up making some recommendations because the pandemic highlighted some of the shortcomings. Most offices don't have continuity of operations plan, including just minimum safety requirements. Most offices did not have up-to-date technology and equipment, so that if there was a disruption in listen, this was a time where members, where the needs of our constituents were so overwhelming, it was perhaps more important than ever for offices to be responsive. That's really hard when they don't have, just basic things like, remote access to their technology systems. The ability to do things like do casework without having, a document that someone has signed in person. That's really hard to do in the midst of a global pandemic. Trying to make telework work better. All of these things are areas that we made recommendations. I'm not sure whether we would have made as many recommendations in that regard as we did, but for the pandemic. I will say, and Tom and I were just on a call talking about this, the committee did not get to, and I think I'm seeing in the chat, Tim Romer has a question about things that we didn't get to. We did not get to the sort of existential question and constitutional question of, if there is a pandemic or a terrorist event that incapacitates a large number of members of Congress, what does that look like? And how does Congress respond? And what are the rules of the road? We will acknowledge in the final report that that is not something that the committee was able to dive into, but that we think is really important. I'll stop there, and then maybe Tom will have things to add.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point, Elizabeth, on the continuity. As Derek said, we were beginning down that road, and it really had to accelerate our deep dive into it, and as well as it helped us identify some of the challenges and some of the weaknesses, and ultimately and when I say weaknesses, it's just the ability to swiftly adapt to a telework environment, from a committee process to an office process. And some were able to a little bit quicker than others, and to begin making recommendations to make sure that if something like this were ever to happen again, that Congress and the constituency work, in addition to the official legislative work, and the responsibilities of members of Congress, could continue without disruption. And so this was a great test of the system in which we didn't really have a plan for, but it helped us identify. And I must say, most offices, I think, really adapted very, very well. And certainly there were challenges in a lot of different spaces, but we sort of wrapped it all up with, and there's unique recommendations that deal with more cybersecurity aspect, training, and making sure district spaces are secure as well because of the remote work environment there, but also homes. Think about how many video conferences or discussions or work is happening from home environments with personal devices and personal routers through personal services. How do you protect some of those as well? But ultimately, one of our recommendations was a bipartisan, bicameral task force to identify what are the lessons learned from this pandemic, what did we do well, and what do we need to improve upon and be better prepared for in the future. And I think that'll be a fascinating report in the future when that comes out, and it'll be very, very beneficial, but a lot of lessons learned during this period.
Because I was wondering, in one of those lessons, maybe there's some things now that we can do, maybe more remote field hearings and things, that it might even lead to a different schedule. Certainly that was one of the things the Legacy Project looked at, is maybe should we really be looking at, with women in the workforce, many more women in Congress, people with children, like travel, all of these things, does that allow for, and will this pandemic time allow us to think differently about that structure of how the time is used and what is the most effective and efficient way to get the work done and to be accessible? So I think a number of us on the call, and I'm seeing a number of remarks to this extent, wondering whether there might be appetite to extend the work of this Congress, of this select committee, into another Congress, and whether you've had any conversations with the Senate about this. I mean, obviously, to the extent it's House rules and House organization, that is specific to the House. I saw some notes suggesting you had met with the Senate. It sounded like it might be, as the usual joke is, the enemy is the Senate. If you can shed any light on whether, are they doing any of this? Do you think there's opportunity, particularly post-pandemic, to continue that?
I hope so. I mean, the reality is many of the recommendations that we've made would require action from the Senate, including some we're hopefully going to make next week related to budget and appropriations process, where the House, putting down a marker is valuable, but it will need buy-in from the Senate as well. Not to mention the fact that there are a number of systemic issues that are not unique to the House. To the point of your question, there is not, from at the top levels, there has not been a dialogue about doing something collaboratively with the Senate. But there are certainly members of the Senate that have reached out to me, and I know to Tom as well, to say, so talk to me about what you guys are doing and how this works, because there's a lot of interest in replicating it in the Senate or potentially doing something collaboratively between the House and the Senate.
Elizabeth, let me add to that, because there's some really great stories that from last year and this year that have developed from this. And it really has to do with, you ask about the committee's extension or maybe being, recreated for the next Congress. We were set to expire last year, and but there was so much good work and momentum and feedback and adoption of that feedback that members of both parties, from the Republican Study Committee to the New Dems to the freshman class, all across the board, they petitioned our leadership to say, please extend, and both sides, extend this committee and allow them to finish their work and get more done, because there's more to be done. In fact, Derek was the first Democrat in the history of Congress to attend and address the Republican Study Committee. And he was so well received, and we had a great time there. And I went with him to the New Dems and had a great discussion and felt welcomed and warmly welcomed there. So what people saw is that this was a committee that's actually getting things done. They're reaching out, and it might be the one spot where when a member has an idea to improve things, it might get implemented because there's that desire to take ideas, because no idea was too big or too small, to take those ideas and to work them into a positive solution or an outcome. And so I could easily see a desire for it to continue forward. And but we're working under the assumption that the end of October is the terminating point.
Now, can I quick get an update on your timing? We all heard the bell for votes. How soon are we going to lose you?
I'm not real sure.
Maybe 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Let me ask one more, and then I think Jason Altmeyer, you are up first. I think the cybersecurity ones are really pretty profound. We already saw that certainly in 2016. There's been a lot of churn around that in the run up to this election. But then when you contemplate continuity of government and working from home, it's something that in discussions some of us had with parliamentarians from other countries, they're grappling with. And frankly, our technology has been pretty far behind, and members of Congress have often been pretty far behind. Are you finding leadership is supportive of that? Do you think there's opportunity for more funding? Because obviously it's going to take funding for training more secure devices. A lot of things, people who have remote home locations or office locations may not have the capacity to do some of these things. So why don't we ask, what's been the response of leadership? And do you think you'll get support for increased funding? Because there's no way some of these things on the tech side, even with more efficient bidding, which is, thank you for the more efficient bidding part, but even so, there's going to have to be upgrades of lots of systems. Derek, what are you hearing from leadership?
Well, I may invite Tom, because he's sort of taken the lead on the cyber and technology stuff, to take first swing at this, and then I'm happy to chime in. But I can tell you overall, as we've done recommendations, we've sat down with leadership, walked them through it, and they've been very supportive of the work that our committee has done. But let me invite Tom to dive into the nitty gritty of it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Derek. And he's right. I would say that all the recommendations that we've passed out, when you think about a committee such as ours, they've been unanimous. That wouldn't be possible if there wasn't some support from both leadership teams. But when it comes to technology, I think everybody knows that technology is far outpacing Congress right now. And Derek loves to use the line about what we're a 18th century institution in a 21st century world, trying to solve things with a 20th century solution set, in a way, I guess, is a sort of a paraphrase from transitioning that to technology. And that is a great challenge that we have. And so I think this committee has been able to hold hearings that really dig down and find out, where are the breakdowns? How can we onboard technology a little quicker? Because the process right now is, by the time you get technology approved and ready to go, it's already out of date and something new is replacing it, or there's something better out there and more efficient. So speeding up that process, and then and really centralizing the process a little bit more we talk about reestablishing the Office of Technology Assessment, creating some hubs as well, and sort of giving the resources for the offices to work within. But one thing we did notice, and this came from Kathleen Rice, she was a big proponent of mandatory cybersecurity training for members, and that is not a requirement. And yet we use multiple devices, from our phones to our laptops to our devices in our office and out of the office. And sometimes we don't have an awareness, I would say all members don't have an awareness of the threat vulnerabilities that all these unique devices being connected in different ways can pose. And so mandatory cybersecurity training was a big piece of this. As well as just creating those hubs where offices had a one-stop shop, in essence, to go to when it comes to technology questions or upgrades or centralization of whatever they might be trying to do within their office. And then the buying power of technology, of getting technology by allowing the strength of the buying power of the House of Representatives to reduce costs and create more options for everybody. So there's a lot more we need to do. And I'll end on this. One thing we did recognize through the pandemic, though, is that when you disrupt the workforce and you push them all out away from the most secure network there is, and that's in the House of Representatives, and you push them off into all these other networks, there's a lot of vulnerability in that space, whether it's in the district offices or is in the homes, as I mentioned before, and all the personal devices and routers and such being used. That's probably going to be the next step of discussion, I would imagine, is how do we begin securing devices in the remote world.
Now I think that clearly is going to take and should be taken up with the Senate as well, and it's going to need to be an appropriations issue, because certainly any of us who've looked into that have realized, if you're dealing with people's social security numbers, dealing with social security claims, veterans claims, you're going to have to find some way to process those documents. I think given that we want to get questions in before you have to run out the door, Jason, can we get you unmuted for the first question?
Yeah. Hi, guys.
Hello.
And Tom, good luck to you with whatever comes next. Proud of your service. I was wondering, is it possible in the next Congress to have the bills separated rather than putting everything into one bill, giving people a chance to express what they don't like about the bill and voting against it? When considering reforms, to break them up, consider them individually. And then one example would be very topical to next session, gerrymandering reform. Could a reapportionment independent commission bill be moved separately rather than put into a larger bill?
Maybe I'll take first swing at this. The good news out of the work of the select committee is so far all of our recommendations have been unanimous. And so a lot, which is not to say that we're not about to take on some more controversial subjects with our recommendations for that we're hoping to land next week. And I think we reserve the right to try to put those forward again in a resolution, some of which may be broken up to your point, just to make sure that if folks have a concern about something, they're able to do that. Your broader point about reform and whether we're talking about partisan gerrymandering or campaign finance or other things, you're right that the challenge of the kind of really large omnibus bills is that there can often be, plenty for someone to dislike in a bill, and that can tank any progress from being made. You saw, and listen, I've worked with issue 1 on a bill to reform the Federal Election Commission. It's a bipartisan bill. I've worked on a bill called the Honest Ads Act to have the same rules around disclosure when you're doing online political ads as you do for broadcast television and radio. That's a bipartisan bill, and not just in the House and the Senate. It's a Lindsey Graham and Amy Klobuchar bill. And, as a standalone bill, that would pass, that would get signed into law, and that would probably start making a difference. And that is one of the shortcomings of some of these more omnibus bill approaches. So maybe that was a lengthy answer. The short answer is, yeah, I hope so.
All right, David Skaggs, I hope you saw my note that you are up next on bipartisan retreats. Or can we get David unmuted? All right, I am not seeing David on this. So, all right, he was talking about if he may have had to leave. So what he
I see his box, but it's muted.
It's muted, and I'm seeing him disappeared off of that. So he had.
No, I'm back. I'm sorry. I thought.
Good. We didn't want to speak in your name, so go
right. Sorry for the delay. I just wanted to add on to endorse your inclination to bring back the bipartisan retreats, and urge you, if you haven't already, to talk to Debbie Dingell, who was at the time we did these 20 years ago a spouse and a powerful advocate for having families. That if there is one thing that will sort of break down the initial distancing between members, it's having kids and spouses around. So I hope you'll be able to get that back online. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have up Jim Slattery about some of the civility recommendations, which a lot of people are very interested in. Go ahead, Jim, if you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Am I unmuted? Okay. Several quick things. First of all, I think you've already answered at least partially my question about leadership buy-in, and especially on these issues of encouraging bipartisan places on the Hill where people can get together and get to know each other, and also the bipartisan orientation, which I think is extremely important. Back in the day, we would retreat to Harvard and hear from experts on both sides of issues. And Republicans and Democrats were there hearing both sides presented sort of away from all the talking points of the campaigns. And I found that to be extremely valuable. And I think members on both sides of the aisle did. The last point I would make is that I think the experience of the Energy and Commerce Committee between 1983 and 1995, led by Chairman John Dingell, is a remarkable history of bipartisan legislative accomplishment. And it's worth studying. And as a member of the committee during that period of time, I can tell you that every bill we passed out of that committee of consequence was bipartisan over that entire period until we got to healthcare. And we couldn't get it together on healthcare in 1993, 94. But environmental legislation, telecom legislation, railroad legislation. I mean, we used to joke that we had jurisdiction over everything that moved in America. And the product of that committee was absolutely amazing. About 65% of all the legislation that became law during that period of time passed through that committee, believe it or not. And Dingell did a remarkable job, but it's a great sort of case study about how this can be done. And I can tell you one of the things he focused on was working the subcommittees, requiring the subcommittees to really start the process, moving up through the full committee. And by the time that bill was worked through the full committee, it was bipartisan. And Dingell used to lecture all the hotspurs on that committee about the fact that Ronald Reagan was the president and we had to get his signature, or George Bush was the president and we had to get his signature to get anything done. So anyway, just share that with you.
Yeah, can you
Thanks
talk
for your work
about your whether you made recommendations on committees? I know certainly that was one of the things that came out of the former members. One was to return more power to committees. I know some of us problem solvers, other groups, other bipartisan groups have focused a lot on the committee structure. It looks like you did not as much. Can you talk a little bit about that? If that's something you think should be part of, if there's a continuation or a reboot, a modernization 2.0 in the next Congress, whether you put that on the agenda for that committee or whether other places are dealing with that.
So some of the recommendations we made were to encourage more kind of bipartisan learning and bipartisan agenda setting and briefings within the committees. So that was one of the recommendations we made. We have had discussions around how do you incent that? Is there a way to, to basically make sure the incentives are aligned? Because to the last question, John Dingell did that because he wanted to get things done in an era of split government. That he wanted to get things done, and too often that's not happening in this place. And listen, the notion of having a bipartisan retreat and encouraging bipartisan committee retreats, don't sleep on the importance of that. Before I got to Congress, among other things, I worked as a consultant for McKinsey and Company. And as a consequence, I don't go to the men's room without a strategic plan. But my observation is I have never seen a functional organization that has been successful that didn't on the front end define what success looks like in a collective manner. And that often does not happen both broadly as an institution or at the committee level. And I think that is something that ought to change and that our committee is working to change.
Yeah, Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'll sort of bring us to a wrap here if that's possible, because I know we've got to sneak off and actually go do our job. But I will say this, that what we've done as a committee, I think at the end we'll have more than 100 recommendations for a Congress, and it's going to be for future Congresses. And we're leaving this Congress, or I guess we're leaving the next Congress, a playbook and that they can begin pulling these unique ideas and implementation where they can. And we've seen historically that's generally how it works. So we have I wish it was all being implemented now and could be, but we know that as challenges arise in the days ahead, this is going to be a great playbook for the next Congress and the next Congress to begin pulling from and implementing and calling those plays. And so while I get to watch it from afar, I'm excited to know that Derek will be in place as these things begin being implemented into the process, and he experiences a better Congress that's working better for the American people. But thanks for having us today.
And Derek, a few wrap-up words. I know you folks have got to get going to vote.
Yeah, we got to go vote. Let me just again express gratitude to the former members, and I actually want to just put in a quick plea for help in two respects. One, next week, most likely, we will make a few dozen recommendations, some of which may have some controversy around them related to restoring Article 1 authorities of the House, some related to trying to build additional capacity so that we can hang on to the talented people who work here that often are not adequately compensated. And so we will likely be making recommendations in those arenas. And it would be valuable to have former members and many of the reform organizations that are on this discussion provide some air cover, because I think it is important to making those reforms that we will propose are going to be important to making this institution work better. And as stewards of this organization, as former members, I hope you'd be willing to weigh in on that front. And then the other thing is, our goal from day one has been not to make recommendations that go get put on a shelf. We want to actually see this place change and function better for the American people. That's why Tom has been such a terrific partner in this. But even though this committee expires at the end of October, our work doesn't. And trying to actually get these recommendations implemented is going to be something that I, as a member, and ideally all of the organizations and former members on this Zoom can be partners in that undertaking as well. So I know we got to go vote, but thank you again for having us, and thank you all for your partnership.
Well, thank you, Derek. Thank you, Tom. Best of luck to you, Tom. And to Derek's point, I read last week some Yale political scientists were saying ads may not be very effective, but actually op-eds are very effective at changing the national dialogue and what gets covered in the media. So I think that is a reminder to everyone on the point of, get out there and support. And I think for former members and I know Vic Fazio wanted to ask a question, Derek, specifically on support for better salaries for staff, make it more possible to retain the talent and the institutional knowledge we have, rather than forcing people who really do want to do public service saying, I can't send my kids to college if I keep working in the people's house. And that's not a good choice people should have to make. And former members can make that case more easily than present members can. So again, thank you very much. Go vote, don't miss votes because of this. But I want to thank again everyone from the Former Members of Congress Association, to thank our chair and vice chair, and thank you all, and to all the supporting organizations who are on with us today. Thank you for your efforts to support the Former Members Association, and most importantly, to help support the efforts for a fully functioning, robust Article 1 branch that does its job for the American people. Thank you all very much, and please look for invitations for the upcoming Former Members Association events.